Feel free to start. I already present you. You can we
Okay, nice to meet you, everybody. And my talk will be about determinism, and I'll try to make a relation with the theme of the conference, decision making and responsibility. Now I'll try to share my screen. Just a minute. Well, then my talk will be about determinism, decision making, and responsibility. Excuse me because I'm not a native speaker of English, so sometimes I'll have perhaps difficulty in finding the right word to speak. Well, um, first I'll start saying something about what determinism is not. Determinism is not the thesis that everything has a cause. In fact, this thesis is compatible with determinism. Determinism implies this thesis, but this thesis does not imply determinism. It is also consistent with an alternative to determinism, which is probabilistic causality. Okay. Determinism is also not the thesis that there are events that can be predicted with certainty. Probabilistic causality also accepts that some events can be predicted with certainty, but not that all events should be, in principle, predictable with certainty. Determinism is also not the only view possible for those who accept physicalism about the mind-brain relation. Again, probabilistic causation is also compatible with monism about the mind-brain relation. I think I'll need to go back to my presenter view because that's where I have my notes to complete what the slides. If it's not very bad for you to have this screen, I think that perhaps we could use it. So determinism is also not the set of causes of a given phenomenon or condition. But the word is often used in this sense in the scientific literature. For instance, I have recorded here two examples from scientific literature. One saying, showing how important these risk factors may be as part of the complex determinism of Alzheimer's disease. This does not imply determinism in its technical sense. This is simply compatible with a meaning of determinism that is identical to causality, to the set of causes that may be probabilistic and not deterministic. Another example, the intergenerational determinism of neurodevelopment and behavior. This is the set of causes, of course, of neurodevelopment and behavior. But we shouldn't say that this use of the word is wrong. It's simply another use of the word. It's not the technical, philosophical use of the word determinism, but it's important for us to make this distinction. Now let's come to the standard definition, the technical definition of determinism. In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, we find this definition by Hofer. Causal determinism is, roughly speaking, the idea that every event is necessitated by antecedent events and conditions together with the laws of nature. There are two words here that I'd like to stress. The first one is roughly. We could try to make it more precise. We could say that it involves every event down to its smallest detail, down to every aspect of these events. So this means that with the same previous total state of the universe, no other subsequent total state of the universe is possible. This means that there is no counterfactual possibility. According to determinism, we don't live at the best possible world, as Leibniz claimed, but at the only possible world, in fact. The other word I'd like to stress is necessitated. Necessarily is usually contrasted with possible, which may be non-necessary. But if everything is necessary, then the only contrast to make is with the impossible, which becomes identical to the non-necessary. So that the four corners of the modal square of opposition and the six corners of the modal hexagon of opposition, I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with these concepts from logic, reduce in fact to two extremes, 2 points, the necessary and the impossible, so that everything that is real is necessary, and everything that is unreal is impossible. Another useful definition is by William James, who said that the future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb. Any other future complement than the one fixed from eternity is impossible. For example, who will be the future president of the United States or Brazil or any other country, or the future prime minister of Israel, for example? Well, they are all already chosen. They will not be chosen. They are already chosen in a certain way because it's already determined. Since the Big Bang, it was determined who will be the future prime minister of Israel. We should say that they are determined, in fact, not chosen, because there is no real choice. Choosing is just an illusion. Another useful definition by Van Inwagen. For every instant in time, there is a proposition that expresses the state of the world at that instant, the state of the whole world at that instant. B, if A and B are propositions that express the state of the world at some instance, then the conjunction of A with the laws of physics entails B, and vice versa. So we see here that we have some incredible concepts, the concepts of a proposition that can encompass the whole world. Um, and the full loss of nature. And in fact, he reduces here the loss of nature to the loss of physics. And he supposes that there can be a proposition that describes the whole state of the whole world, well, in a single instant. Well, let's go on to another classic definition, that one by Laplace in 1814, who says that an intelligence which for one given instant would know all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the entities which compose it, if besides it were sufficiently vast to submit all these data to mathematical analysis, would encompass in the same formula, how complex this formula would have to be, huh? The movements of the largest bodies of the universe and those of the lightest atom. For it, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, as the past, would be present to its eyes. So here we see the idea of a cognitive system and intelligence that has no material basis, that occupies no space, that works without spending any energy and taking no time. We may argue that an intelligence that could encompass all the universe at a certain instant would be at least as big as the universe itself. If it's to be a part of the universe, it simply cannot exist. Someone would perhaps object to this, saying that this is merely an epistemological argument, not an ontological one, because Laplace here is speaking of the possibility of knowing the universe. Perhaps there would be practical, I would say, not only practical but theoretical difficulties, impediments for this that he describes to be possible. But someone would perhaps say that this is just an epistemological question, that this involves only the possibility of knowing, that we could still ontologically imagine that the universe is such that all its previous states determine any of its future states, and vice versa, in a completely precise way. Well, I think that this, in fact, would have to call in question this separation of ontology and epistemology, because when ontology tries to say something about what things are, and of course we can only say something about what things are from what we know about them. So I think that, in fact, this quotation by Laplace is very relevant, even for the question of the ontological status of determinism. Well, now we come to another use of the word. The word determinism can be used and has been used and is frequently used in a different sense, and not in this technical philosophical sense of a very strict determinism. It can be used simply as a synonym of causation or causality, And in this case, we can speak and we find quotations, we find texts that use terms such as probabilistic determinism, statistical determinism, agent determinism, or sentences like those that I have already given examples of, saying the determinism of a certain phenomenon as the set of causes of this phenomenon. Well, now we come to adjectives that are used with determinism. Causal determinism, the idea that every event is strictly determined by previous events called causes. This conception, in fact, faces a serious difficulty to my mind, that we would have to accept that this series of events, which are each of them effects of previous events and causes of future events, that then these series of events would have to extend indefinitely to the future and to the past. Alternatively, we may accept that the Big Bang is the beginning of everything and the beginning of time itself. But if so, the Big Bang itself is an uncaused cause, which contradicts the thesis that every event is strictly determined by previous events. If the Big Bang is an event, then it would have to be caused by a previous event. But by definition, it has no previous event. So it would be an uncaused cause. It takes the place of God in the theological determinism. We can we can say that the Big Bang is the modern scientific myth of the beginning. Every religion has the need for a myth of creation. And so the Big Bang is our scientific myth of creation. But this, in fact, does not avoid certain difficulties that I think are inherent to our very thinking about these kinds of problems, because it's difficult not to think of a time before the beginning of time. We say everything started with the Big Bang. Okay, but and before the Big Bang, what happened? No, nothing happened before the Big Bang. Okay, but then the Big Bang is something that was not caused. So if there is the possibility of something there that is not caused, then the thesis of causal determinism is not really accepted down to its last consequences. So it seems that here we have really a limit to the possibility of human knowledge. Just a minute. Can you hear me well? Do you think that I'm speaking in a way that you can understand? It's the volume of my voice, okay? Can you answer me, please?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Okay, thank you. So let's go on. Another adjective, divine determinism, also called theological determinism. No, God is the only and complete cause of every event or action. This involves, of course, a double possibility. We may ask, a direct cause or an indirect cause of all events? If God is only an indirect cause, then he would be the direct cause only at creation. Some people, like Einstein, for example, seem to identify God with nature in some way, so that by studying nature, we are studying God's will. In this view, God is the only uncaused cause. God, and according to this view, God wanted the world to be deterministic, so he chose that events would be deterministic. And here we have the famous sentence by Einstein saying that God doesn't play dice. So God created the initial world and the laws of nature, and then everything follows the laws of nature. And God, in principle, does not normally interfere with events, so that Einstein can study how nature works and find how God made our world. Okay, God would be able, in fact, to interfere with the events of nature. And that would be in the instance of miracles. But how often do miracles occur? That's a question difficult to answer. Some people even say that everything in the world is a miracle, while others say that nothing in the world is a miracle. Everything follows strictly from the laws of nature. Well, now we can go to another adjective used with determinism: strict determinism or absolute determinism. This is the idea of a complete determination of every aspect of every event, down to the smallest detail. In fact, this is a synonym of determinism, according to the standard definition. Partial determinism In fact, partial determinism is an expression that is inconsistent with the standard definition of determinism. Because if determinism involves all the events, then there can be no partial determinism. However, it may be used if the standard definition is not accepted or is not used at a certain moment. Soft determinism. Now, this is something that goes, in fact, beyond the question of determinism, and that involves its relation with the concept of free will and responsibility. What is called soft determinism? It's the thesis that causal determinism is true, but it is considered free but it is considered compatible with the idea that we are free and responsible when our actions are caused by our desires. By contrast, hard determinism accepts as well causal determinism, but assumes that it implies that we are not free and responsible. Now let's see the opposites of some opposites of determinism. First, we can use the expression non-determinism, that is a simple contradictory of determinism. since determinism says that all events are completely determined down to the smallest detail, it suffices that some events are not completely determined to have a contradiction of determinism. Then we may use the word indeterminism. And this word may be used either as a synonym of non-determinism, as a variant of the word non-determinism, but it may also be understood as the idea that nothing is in fact completely determined, that no natural event can have a probability of 1. According to this meaning, determinism and indeterminism cannot be both true, but can be both false. We can also make a contrast between determinism and probabilistic causation, or probabilistic causality. And this is the view that I will be arguing for today. This is the idea that events may have all probability values from 0 to 1. It does not exclude impossible events and necessary events having probabilities of 0 and 1 respectively, but it also admits events having all probabilities between 0 and 1. According to determinism, causes are always necessary and sufficient for their effects. For probabilistic causality, some causes are necessary and sufficient, okay, but others may be unnecessary or insufficient for their effects. In fact, for determinism, the cause of any effect is the whole state of the universe at a previous instant. Other things that determinism is not. I argue that determinism is not a scientific fact. Of course, we must recognize that many scientific facts involve cause-effect relations. And it's also reasonable to suppose that every event has causes. But there is nothing to show that all causes must be deterministic and not probabilistic, at least some of them. There is no scientific evidence for determinism, in fact. I think we can confidently say that there is no scientific evidence for determinism, because determinism is a thesis about all events, and all scientific theories are theories about some events, about some field of events, some class of phenomena of reality. Moreover, there are many well-grounded scientific theories that rely on probabilistic causality. And here we can mention, for example, radioactive decay, quantum physics, meteorology, genetics, evolution, and immunology. So it isn't a scientific fact, but we could ask, is it a scientific hypothesis? I argue that it's not a scientific hypothesis either, because it's not testable. Any scientific hypothesis must be testable, and it's evidently impossible to devise a test for an idea that is so all-embracing, an idea that involves everything, every phenomenon. You cannot test every phenomenon. It is not a scientific presupposition also. We could think that even if it's not a fact, not a hypothesis, it's a presupposition that is necessary for science. But I think there's no reason to suppose that it's necessary for science. Science may be very well content with descriptive and causal theories, and it may very well assume that some cause-effect relations are deterministic, but others are only probabilistic. So then, what is determinism? We have already seen that it's the thesis that everything is determined, that we could in principle infer any state of the universe from any other state of the universe, that everything is strictly determined. But what is this? What is this kind of idea? If it's not fact, a scientific fact, it's not a hypothesis, it's not a theory, a scientific theory, it's not a scientific presupposition, I think we could call it a doctrine. And here is a definite dictionary definition of a doctrine: a set of beliefs held and taught by a group. Or else we could say that it is an ideology, also defined by a dictionary as a set of beliefs characteristic of a social group. Or going a little farther, we could say that it is a dogma, that is, a principle laid down by authorities as incontrovertibly true. And finally, as a myth. The dictionary defines a myth as a traditional story explaining a natural or social phenomenon, or an exaggerated or idealized conception of a thing. And I think we can very well say that determinism is an exaggerated and idealized version of causality. Now we come to another point, which is the self-defeating nature of determinism. So can we really coherently support determinism? The idea that determinism is self-defeating has been supported by many. The idea that if we were to accept determinism in a fully consistent and way, and going to the last consequences, accepting all consequences of this doctrine, of this kind of thinking, of this ideology, would this not undermine the very concept of determinism? The first one to propose this idea was perhaps Epicurus, around the 3rd century, before the Christian era, in Greek philosophy. He has a famous saying that the man who says that all things come to pass by necessity cannot criticize one who denies that all things come to pass by necessity. For he admits that this too happens of necessity. Of course, this ironic reasoning, we could say, by Epicurus could be extended in the following way. We could say that if all things come to pass by necessity, then that man also came to think that all things come to pass by necessity, not for any good reasons to think so, but because this very thought came to pass by necessity. In fact, nobody thinks anything because they have good reasons to think that, but because the way the Big Bang occurred determined that they would think precisely that. Whether it is a defense or an attack of determinism. If determinism is true, I was determined since the Big Bang to say precisely the things that I'm saying in this moment, and what you're thinking about what I say, whether you are agreeing or disagreeing, was also determined by the movement of atoms a billion years ago. So this movement of atoms have nothing to do with good or bad reasons to believe that determinism is true or false. Well, there is a long list of authors who have argued for and against the idea that determinism is self-defeating. I will argue for this idea. In many of these discussions, however, there is a conflation of determinism with physicalism. I will cite here, for instance, this quotation by Patricia Churchland discussing Eccles' views on the subject. And she says, it is argued that determinism is incompatible with free will, and since physicalism implies determinism, that physicalism is false. However, physicalism does not imply determinism. Physicalism states that mental events are caused by or are identical to physical events, but it does not imply that these physical events are themselves deterministic. So a concept of bounded free will is wholly compatible with physicalism, even if it's incompatible with determinism. Churchland goes on criticizing Eccles. She says, if determinism is correct, it's not in the least, it does not in the least follow that we do not reason. So she is trying to argue against that idea that determinism is self-defeating, that it contradicts or at least undermines the reasons itself to believe in determinism. She says, on the contrary, what follows is that our reasoning, and our reasoned behavior is causally produced. But we may ask, causally produced or deterministically produced? It's not the same thing. We now see the confusion between causality and determinism. And I think that this is the same confusion that, to my mind, was present in Sapolsky's very interesting talk the day before yesterday here at this conference. He gave us several intriguing examples of studies in neuroscience showing that many choices made by people are influenced by causes that we couldn't imagine were active. But all these examples can be seen as involving probabilistic causes, not determinism. In such cases, we may use determinism as a synonym of causality, but they do not support determinism in its strict sense, in its technical sense. We may agree that our reasoning and our reasoned behavior is causally produced, as Churchland says, and disagree that it is deterministically produced. If the reasoning that leads us to accept determinism is deterministically produced, then all its details were already precisely determined at a time, say 1 billion years ago, when there was not yet any reasoning and any concept of determinism. If I can think that A is true and I can think that A is false, then I can decide that the reasons for thinking that A is true are better than those for thinking that A is false. But if I can think only that A is true, because this was determined since the Big Bang, any consideration of reasons is ocious. And if I engage in such consideration, it's only because both this consideration of reasons and its conclusion were likewise determined since the Big Bang. So what reason do I have to trust the conclusion of such a consideration of reasons? If we say that we think of reason about anything, indeed, this is just bad description according to determinism. We should say only that the elementary particles in the atoms that form the molecules of the neurons in our brain are moving along trajectories that were precisely determined since the beginning of times. Do our thoughts represent anything of the reality of the world? If determinism is true, this is just an illusion, just as the illusion of free will. Our thoughts do not adapt themselves to the goal of representing reality in a process of trying to get near the truth and so on, to discover things, to think what is logical, what is not. If they did, it would be just by coincidence, just by sheer luck. The only thing we can say about our thoughts is that they occur in ways that were determined, in ways that they were determined to occur by previous processes that have nothing to do with ourselves and our present world. Thus, determinism does not only defeat itself, it defeats our reason to trust any thought of it at all. We come to decision-making. If determinism is true, there is no decision-making, in fact. It's just another illusion. You don't make a decision if it's already made, that is, strictly determined. However, if we adopt probabilistic causation instead, then a decision can be made. This is not to say that the decision is uncaused, nor that it is randomly produced. We should say that there is a process in the brain that represents possible alternatives. There is evaluation of each alternative according to different criteria, conscious and unconscious. And there is a process of choosing among them. There are causes, there is a certain degree of randomness, and there is an active process of trying to reach certain goals. The part of the neuroactivity that we call ourself has a greater or lesser part in this process in different cases. Of course, saying simply that there is probabilistic causation does not explain decision-making, does not explain free will, does not explain responsibility. We will have to build theories about this. We will have to devise forms of empirically testing these hypotheses and so on. But this kind of theory is compatible with probabilistic causation, whereas any theory that involves freedom, choice, and things like this is in fact incompatible with determinism in its strict sense. Responsibility, again, if determinism is true, there's no responsibility. It's just another illusion. No one is responsible for anything if everything is fixed from the beginning to the end of the universe. That is, if every change that happens is nothing but the unfolding of something that was already there. It was already completely determined since the beginning. If we adopt probabilistic causation, by contrast, people are responsible for what they did. We can have this hypothesis, this thesis that people are responsible for what they did if it was intentional, if they were aware of the consequences of what they were going to do, if what they were going to do was not completely determined from eternity, if they could have chosen not to do what they did or chosen to act otherwise, then it makes sense to say that they are responsible for what they chose to do. Now we come to responsibility again. And we can say that there may be wrong attributions of responsibility, of course, and I'm thinking again of examples that Sapolsky gave in his talk of wrong attributions of responsibility. But this does not deny the fact that the attribution of responsibility to oneself and to others is an avoidable part of human psychology. Responsibility should not be conceived as an all or nothing phenomenon, however. The establishment of fixed age limits for legal responsibility is certainly inadequate, for example. It's certainly ridiculous to imagine that up to one day before one's 18th birthday, one is completely irresponsible, and from the next day on, completely irresponsible. So, decision making, responsibility, and free will. Many philosophers recognize a link between decision making and responsibility and free will. But the concept of free will itself certainly needs to be changed. Free will does not imply mind-brain dualism. Free will does not imply uncaused causes. It is much more limited than it might be thought, but it's still indispensable to make sense of the human world. It does not involve ultimate responsibility for all causes of our present decisions, but we still can hold people responsible for what they chose to do. I propose to replace the old concept of absolute uncaused free will as a function of any material soul by a concept of bounded free will as a neurofunction of the human brain, acting in a physical, social, and cultural world. And I think this view is compatible with the proposal of Peter Tse in his talk in this conference, as I understood it. And I also propose to abandon the myth of determinism, which is as self-defeating and unjustified today as it was in the time of Epicurus, even in its contemporary pseudoscientific disguise. Thank you for your attention, and all questions and comments are welcome.
Okay, round of applause to our. Thank you very much, Gilberto. So, any questions? Anybody? Nope. Yeah, maybe. What is your view on compatibilism? Yeah, I think I just wanted to know a little bit more about your views on that. Why would you reject that?
Well, I think that compatibilism, when we speak of compatibilism, we should make it clear what we're talking about. The standard definition of compatibilism is compatibilism between free will and determinism. I wouldn't think that this is most interesting concept of compatibilism. I think that it's a much more interesting question to inquire whether there is a compatibility between free will and causality and probabilistic causality, and between free will and physicalism. And I would say that free will, properly defined, is compatible with all of these. It's compatible with monism, is this compatible with causality, it's compatible with the idea that everything has causes. But with the standard, the received concept of determinism, I think we must recognize that it is incompatible. So, my answer to the question of whether we should adopt compatibilism or incompatibilism is nuanced. It depends on what concept of compatibilism we adopt And the other term involved in the concept of compatibilism is also crucial, the concept of free will. There are different concepts of free will. One concept of free will simply says that the will is free from causality, freedom from causality. Of course, if we say that free will is a choice, involves a choice that is free from causal determination, then it's incompatible not only with determinism, but it's incompatible with universal causality. But I think we don't need to accept this old-fashioned concept of free will.
Okay, great. Thank you
Okay.
very much, Gilberto. Anybody else to no? If anybody in the chat wants to ask any questions too, right?
Yes, if anyone in the chat, anyone who
Okay.
is attending
Okay.
online.
Well, in fact,
What?
unfortunately, we are already out of time. Now we'll need to start with next speaker. But before that, let's just a round of applause to Gilberto. Thank you very much.
Thank you.